The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, while the frost was still clinging to the window panes of Ashcombe Hall. It came by the hand of a rider no one recognised, a man in a plain grey coat who did not wait to be thanked, who did not even dismount fully before pressing the envelope into the housekeeper's hands and turning his horse back down the long gravel drive. There was no return address, only a wax seal, dark red, pressed with a crest that had not been used by the family in nearly 15 years. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood at the top of the stairs when the housekeeper brought it to her, and for a long moment she did not move. She knew that seal. She had watched her father press it into wax 100 times as a girl, seated at his desk in the west study, the fire crackling behind him, his voice low and certain as he spoke of duty, of legacy, of a family name that must never be allowed to fade. That desk had been sold 3 years ago. That study had been shuttered since her father's death. And that seal, that particular seal, belonged to no one living. Or so she had believed. Before we go further into what that letter contained, and why a duke would one day stand in the drawing room of this very house and declare, with a cold and certain smile, that Eleanor Whitmore would never make her ruined estate profitable again, I want to ask something of you. If stories like this one, stories of forgotten women who rebuilt everything from nothing, who were underestimated by powerful men and proved them wrong through patience and quiet intelligence, if these stories move you, then take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. And I'd love to know, in the comments below, tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and it means more than you know to see just how far these stories travel. Now, let us return to Ashcombe Hall and to the letter that would change everything. Eleanor was 26 years old when her husband died. Not of illness, not of age, not even of the sort of tragic accident that society could whisper about with sympathy for a season and then forget. Lord Charles Whitmore had died of ordinary things, bad investments, worse debts, and a pride too brittle to admit either before it was far too late. He left behind a manor house with a collapsing east wing, 400 acres of untended farmland, 4 servants where there had once been 40, and a widow the county had already begun to pity in that particular way, the aristocracy reserved for women it no longer considered useful. She did not know then that pity would prove far more dangerous to her than debt ever had. The funeral had been small. Fashionable society did not travel far for a man who had died owing money to half of it. But one man had come. He had stood at the edge of the churchyard in a coat far finer than the weather required, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving not to the grave but to the house beyond it, assessing the way a man assesses a horse he intends to buy cheaply from someone too grieved to negotiate. His name was Duke Reginald Ashworth, and he was Charles Whitmore's cousin twice removed, and the nearest male relative with any claim, however distant, to what remained of the estate. "You'll bury him and be gone within the year," he had said to her, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "A woman cannot hold 400 acres together alone, Lady Whitmore. No one expects you to." She had said nothing. She had only watched the frozen earth close over her husband's coffin and thought, with a clarity that surprised even her, that she did not much care what the Duke expected. But she did not yet understand how much he intended to make certain of it. The months that followed were the quiet kind of hard, the kind no one writes ballads about. There were no villains storming the gates, no dramatic confrontations in candlelit halls. There was only the slow, grinding arithmetic of survival. Coal that had to be rationed, rooms that had to be closed off one by one because there was no one to heat them and no one to clean them. A cook who left for a wealthier household and could not be replaced. A roof in the east wing that let the rain in every time the wind turned from the north. She did not know then that the very neglect of that east wing, the one she wept over on cold nights, certain it would collapse before spring, would one day hold the key to everything. She sold what jewelry remained. She sold the good silver, all but a single set her mother had given her, which she kept hidden beneath the floorboard of her bedroom, as if some instinct told her she was not yet meant to let go of every last piece of who she had been. The tenants who farmed her land grew wary and thin-voiced when she visited them, unsure whether to trust a landlady who could no longer promise repairs, who arrived on foot because there was no longer a carriage horse to spare. Old Thomas Reed, who had farmed the northern fields for 30 years under her husband's family, said to her once, not unkindly, "Begging your pardon, my lady, but a house without a man in it don't often stand long in these parts." She had smiled at him, thin and tired, and said, "Then I suppose I shall have to be the exception, Mr. Reed." She did not fully believe it herself. Not yet. It was the Duke who came to call in the spring, exactly as she had known he would. He arrived in a carriage far too grand for the narrow, rutted drive of Ashcombe Hall, and he did not bother to disguise his appraisal of the house's condition as he stepped down. The peeling paint, the ivy grown wild and untrimmed across the south face, the single stable boy who came to take his horses because there was no longer a groom. He was shown into the drawing room, one of the few rooms still properly furnished, and he took his tea with the practiced ease of a man who had never once in his life wondered whether there would be more where that came from. "I have come," he said, "to make you an offer, Lady Whitmore. A generous one, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Eleanor repeated evenly, "being that I am a widow, and you believe a widow cannot manage what a husband left in ruin." "The circumstances," he corrected, with the faint, indulgent smile of a man used to being agreed with, "being that Ashcombe has not turned a profit in 6 years, that its debts exceed what its land could fetch at auction, and that you, my dear cousin, are attempting to hold together something that is already gone. I am prepared to purchase the estate outright. You would retain a small allowance. A cottage, perhaps, in the village. A respectable, quiet life." "A respectable, quiet life," she said slowly, "in which I own nothing my husband's family built, an answer to nothing but your generosity." "It is not an insult, Eleanor," his voice softened, just slightly, in the way of a man who believed himself generous precisely because he had never had to be otherwise. "It is arithmetic. You'll never make it profitable. No one could, not with what's left of it. I am offering you dignity instead of ruin." She did not answer him immediately. She looked, instead, past his shoulder to the window, where the overgrown garden stretched out toward the crumbling east wing, the wing she had not dared enter in months, for fear of what disrepair she might find there. "I will consider your offer, your grace," she said finally, "but I do not think I am finished with this house yet." He left with the faint, tolerant amusement of a man who believed her refusal was merely pride, and pride, he was certain, could not pay a single debt. He did not know then, nor did she, that the very ruin he had dismissed so easily contained the one thing that would undo him. It was Mrs. Hartley, the last of the old servants, who first mentioned the room. She was elderly by then, her hands stiffened with years of service, but she had worked at Ashcombe since before Eleanor's husband was born, and she remembered things the family itself had long forgotten. One evening, as Eleanor sat by a small fire mending a dress she could no longer afford to replace, Mrs. Hartley set down the tea tray and said, quietly, almost as if she had been waiting for permission to speak it aloud, "There's a room in the east wing, my lady, behind the old nursery. Your husband's grandfather had it sealed, must be 40 years now. I don't believe a living soul has opened it since." Eleanor's needle stilled in her hand. Sealed? Why? Mrs. Hartley's face, usually so composed, flickered with something Eleanor could not quite name. Caution, perhaps, or grief, worn smooth by decades. That, my lady, I could not rightly say. Only that the old master forbade anyone from speaking of it, and forbidding a thing in this house has a way of making people forget it was ever there at all. She did not know then that a room sealed for 40 years does not stay silent forever, that walls, given enough time, always find a way to speak. It took Eleanor 3 days to work up the courage to go to the east wing alone. The corridor leading to it was exactly as she remembered from childhood visits, before she had ever imagined this house would one day be hers to save or lose. Dust thick upon the floor, the wallpaper peeling in long curling strips, portraits of Whitmores, long dead, watching from their frames, with the particular blankness of the forgotten. At the end of the corridor stood a door unlike the others, heavier, iron-banded. A lock rusted nearly solid with age. It took her the better part of an hour, and the help of an old keyring she found in her husband's abandoned desk, before the lock finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire wing. The room beyond was not, as she had half feared, some Gothic horror of a place. It was simply a study, smaller than her father-in-law's grand one downstairs, but clearly once well used. A desk sat beneath a shuttered window, still layered with papers gone brittle and yellow with age. Bookshelves lined one wall, thick with dust, and in the corner, half covered by a moth-eaten cloth, stood a locked chest bearing a crest she recognized at once. The very same seal that had arrived on that Tuesday morning letter. Her breath caught in her throat. She did not yet understand what she had found. She only understood, with a certainty that ran through her like cold water, that this room had been sealed not out of neglect, but out of fear. She did not know then that inside that chest lay a secret that had shaped 3 generations of her husband's family, without any of them ever fully understanding it. A secret about money, about betrayal, and about a woman very much like herself, who had once stood in this very room and made a decision that would echo for decades. The papers on the desk told her the first piece of it. They were correspondence, dozens of letters, between her husband's grandfather, old Josiah Whitmore, and a wool merchant in the north named Abel Gray. Eleanor had never heard the name before in her life, and yet the letters spoke of him as a partner, an equal, a man Josiah trusted with what appeared to be a significant investment in a mill operation. Reading between the careful, formal Victorian phrasing, she began to piece together a story. Josiah Whitmore, in his youth, had not been content to simply inherit and maintain Ashcombe as his fathers had. He had invested, quietly, almost secretly, in the growing wool trade, in mills and looms, and the machinery of a changing England that most aristocratic families still considered beneath them. And for a time, it had worked. The letters spoke of profits, of expansion, of a partnership that had made both men considerably wealthy. Until, abruptly, in the autumn of 1841, the correspondence stopped. There was no explanation in the letters themselves, only a final, terse note from Abel Gray, dated November of that year, which read simply, "You know what you have done. I will not speak of it again, but I will not forget it either." She did not know then what Josiah Whitmore had done, but she suspected, even in that first reading, that it was the reason this room had been sealed for 40 years, and the reason no one in the family had ever spoken of where their fortune had truly come from, or how quickly and mysteriously it had disappeared. The chest, when she finally found the strength and the tools to force its old lock, held the second piece. Inside were ledgers, detailed, meticulous financial records, the kind a careful man keeps not for pride, but for guilt, as though documenting a sin might somehow atone for it. Eleanor spent 3 full nights by candlelight working through them, her eyes aching, her fingers stained with dust, and slowly, a picture began to emerge that made her sick with understanding. Josiah Whitmore had not simply invested in Abel Gray's mill. At some point, as the operation grew more profitable, he had found a way to quietly redirect a significant portion of the profits into his own accounts. Disguised through a series of falsified partnership records, profits that should rightfully have gone to Gray and to the dozens of mill workers whose wages, the ledgers showed, had been deliberately underpaid to inflate the appearance of costs. It was not simply a private betrayal between two gentlemen. It was theft, dressed in the polite language of Victorian finance, built upon the underpayment of working families who had no power to challenge a Whitmore's word against their own. She did not know then that this single act, buried and sealed away for 40 years, was the true origin of everything. The family fortune that had built this house, the fortune that had since crumbled through 3 generations of men who spent freely and understood nothing of how it had first been earned, and the reason the Ashworth family, distant cousins though they were, had always eyed Ashcombe with a strange proprietary hunger that never quite made sense to her. Not until she found the final letter in the chest, the one addressed not to Josiah Whitmore, but from him, unsent, to a young man named Reginald. The letter was dated 1841, the same autumn the correspondence with Abel Gray had gone silent. It was addressed to Josiah's nephew, a boy of perhaps 15 at the time, being raised by a branch of the family that Eleanor now understood, with growing dread, would one day produce the very Duke who sat in her drawing room and called her ruin an inevitability. My dear Reginald, the letter began, I write this knowing I may never send it. For some truths are better carried alone than shared even with blood. You are young yet, and I would spare you the weight of what I have done. But should fortune ever turn against our family, should the day come when Ashcombe's line falters, and yours must reckon with what remains, I want you to understand the foundation upon which this house truly stands. Eleanor read on, her hands trembling as Josiah Whitmore confessed, in ink, to a nephew he never sent the words to, the full truth of what he had taken from Abel Gray and the arrangement he had struck to keep it buried. He had paid Gray a modest settlement, enough to silence him, enough that Gray had taken his family north and never spoken publicly of the betrayal, but not nearly enough to represent what had truly been owed. And there, in the final paragraph, was the detail that made Eleanor go still as stone in her candlelit study. The Ashworth line has long resented that Ashcombe passed to my branch of the family rather than theirs, and I confess, Reginald, that the resentment is not without cause. Should they ever learn the truth of how this house was truly funded, I fear they would use it not for justice, but for leverage, to claim what they believe should have been theirs from the start. Guard this secret, or guard against those who would seek it. I fear one day they may do both. She did not know then just how prophetic those words would prove to be, nor that the Duke sitting so comfortably in her drawing room, offering her a generous purchase of her ruined estate, was not simply a distant cousin circling a widow's misfortune. He was the great-grandson of the very boy that letter had been written to, and Eleanor was beginning to understand, with a cold clarity that settled deep in her chest, that his interest in Ashcombe had never been about her at all. It had always, quietly, patiently, across generations, been about this room. Before we go further, and trust me, what Eleanor discovers next changes absolutely everything she believed about her marriage, her husband's family, and the Duke's true intentions. If you're enjoying this story so far, this is the perfect moment to hit that subscribe button. I release stories exactly like this one regularly, full of hidden letters, buried family secrets, and women who were never quite as powerless as the men around them believed. And again, I do love reading where you're all watching from, so if you haven't already, drop a comment below and let me know your city or country. It always amazes me how far these old English manor houses reach. Now, back to that sealed room, and the discovery that would change the course of Eleanor's entire future. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat with the unsent letter long after her single candle had burned low, turning over the implications with the same careful patience she had once used to balance her husband's failing accounts. If the Duke's family had known, or at least suspected, for generations that Ashcombe's fortune had been built upon a betrayal, then his visits, his offers, his cold and confident insistence that she would fail, were not simply about a struggling widow and a crumbling house. He was waiting for her to give up, waiting for the estate to pass, quietly and without scrutiny, into his hands, where any remaining trace of Josiah Whitmore's old sins could be buried forever beneath a new owner's indifference. But there was something else in the ledgers that Eleanor had not fully considered until that night. The mill itself, Abel Gray's mill, the one Josiah had so quietly profited from and then abandoned to scandal, had not vanished. Ledgers of that detail rarely lied, and buried among the oldest papers was a deed, still technically valid, still bearing Josiah Whitmore's name as a silent partner, filed away and forgotten because no one since had ever thought to look. She did not know then whether the mill still stood. She did not know whether the Gray family had rebuilt, moved on, or vanished entirely into the anonymity of England's industrial north. But she knew, with a certainty that startled her, that if any part of that old, buried claim still had value, she intended to find it before the Duke ever suspected she had looked. It took her 6 weeks, and nearly the last of her remaining funds, to travel north and find what remained of Gray's mill. What she found surprised her. The mill had not failed, as Josiah's guilt-ridden letter seemed to fear it might. It had grown, modestly, steadily, under 3 generations of Gray descendants who had rebuilt their family's fortune slowly, honestly, without ever fully understanding why their original success had been so abruptly and mysteriously cut short in 1841. The current owner, a woman named Margaret Gray, sharp-eyed, plainly dressed, and utterly unimpressed by aristocratic titles, was the great-granddaughter of Abel Gray himself. When Eleanor, with considerable trepidation, explained who she was and what she had found sealed away in Ashcombe's east wing, she expected anger. She expected, perhaps, to be thrown out entirely. Instead, Margaret Gray studied her for a long, silent moment, and then said something Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. "My great-grandfather always said a Whitmore owed this family a debt that would one day come due. I confess I never believed I'd live to see one of you walk in through my door and offer to pay it, rather than deny it ever existed." She did not know then that this single conversation, built not on scandal or revenge, but on honesty freely offered, would become the true foundation of everything Eleanor built afterward. What followed was not a swift transformation, nor a fairy tale reversal of fortune. It was, instead, the slow and deliberate work of a woman who had finally found something worth building. Eleanor did not simply inherit a hidden fortune, as a lesser story might have it. The old deed gave her a legitimate, if long dormant, financial stake in the mill, but she understood, with the same clarity that had guided her through those long nights with the ledgers, that simply claiming old money built on old wrongs would make her no better than Josiah Whitmore had been. Instead, she proposed something to Margaret Gray that neither woman had expected to find herself discussing: a partnership. A genuine one, structured honestly, in which Ashcombe's remaining land, its 400 acres, currently producing little beyond enough to feed its own tenants, would be turned towards supplying raw wool directly to Gray's mill, cutting out the costly middlemen that had strangled both the estate's income and the mill's margins for years. It was, in the plain arithmetic the Duke had once used to dismiss her, actually profitable. Not through inheritance, not through charity, through labour, honesty, and a willingness to do the sort of practical, unglamorous work that aristocratic society had always quietly considered beneath a lady's dignity. She did not know then how quickly word of a widow personally overseeing wool shipments, negotiating contracts, and walking her own fields at dawn would spread through county society, nor how many would begin, quietly, to reconsider their assumptions about her. It took 2 full years for Ashcombe to turn its first genuine profit. They were hard years. Eleanor learned more about tenant farming, wool grading, and the treacherous unpredictability of shipping contracts than any lady of her upbringing was ever meant to know. She restored the East Wing, not as a hidden shame to be sealed away again, but as a working estate office, the very desk where Josiah Whitmore once wrote his unsent confession, now serving as the place where Eleanor signed contracts of her own. Contracts built, she made certain, on fairness rather than concealment. Old Thomas Reed, who had once doubted a house without a man in it could stand, became one of her most loyal tenant farmers, telling anyone who would listen in the village that Lady Whitmore worked harder than any lord I ever served, and paid fairer too. She did not know then that the Duke had been watching her progress far more closely than she realised, nor that his patience, once so confident, had begun to curdle into something closer to alarm. He came to call again in the spring of the 2nd year, and this time he did not arrive with the easy, indulgent smile of a man certain of his own eventual victory. He arrived, instead, having heard rumours he did not fully understand, rumours of a widow's estate turning profits, of a mysterious northern partnership, of old family papers, rumoured to have surfaced from a room long thought permanently sealed. "I understand," he said, seated once again in her drawing-room, though considerably less at ease than before, that Ashcombe has found some manner of recovery. "It has," Eleanor said simply, pouring his tea with steady hands. "I confess I am curious as to how." His eyes moved, briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the corridor leading to the East Wing. Given the estate's condition when we last spoke, Eleanor set down the teapot and met his gaze directly, for the first time since her husband's funeral, without a trace of the deference society had once demanded of her. "I found something in your family's history, Your Grace, that I believe you have long suspected existed, but never quite dared to search for yourself." She reached into the drawer of the small table beside her and produced, not the original, she had been far too careful for that, but a faithful copy of Josiah Whitmore's unsent letter. "I believe this belongs, in some sense, to your family's understanding of itself, as much as mine." She did not know, until she watched the colour drain slowly from the Duke's face as he read it, whether he had truly known the full truth of his family's old debt, or only suspected it, whispered down through generations as a rumour too dangerous to confirm. When he finally looked up from the letter, his expression was not the cold confidence she remembered from their first meeting. It was something far more uncertain. "What do you intend to do with this?" he asked quietly. "Nothing that will ruin your family's name, if that is your fear," Eleanor said. "I have already settled what was owed, quietly, honestly, with the Grey family directly, not through scandal, not through the courts, but through partnership. What I intend, Your Grace, is simply to finish what your ancestor lacked the courage to finish himself. To make something honest out of something that was not. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, but they were. At last, difficulties of Eleanor's own choosing, rather than ones forced upon her by other men's failures. Ashcombe's partnership with Gray's Mill grew steadily. The East Wing, once a place of secrets and dust, became known throughout the county as the working heart of one of the more sensibly managed estates in the region, a fact that quietly, gradually, reshaped how society spoke of Eleanor Whitmore. The pity that had once followed her name gave way, slowly, to something she had never expected to earn: respect. She did not seek to humiliate the Duke, nor to expose his family's old sins publicly, though she certainly could have. She understood by then something that Josiah Whitmore in his guilt and the Duke in his pride had both failed to grasp. That true restoration was never about winning at another's expense. It was about building something honest enough to stand entirely on its own. The Duke, for his part, never again suggested that her estate could not be made profitable. Indeed, in a quiet irony that the county whispered about for years afterward, Ashcombe's modest but steady partnership with Gray's Mill soon outperformed the Duke's own sprawling but poorly managed holdings built, as his own family's old ledgers might have shown him if he'd ever cared enough to look, on inherited assumption rather than earned understanding. Margaret Gray became not merely a business partner, but a genuine friend, the two women corresponding for years afterward, their partnership standing as quiet proof that old wrongs, faced honestly rather than buried in sealed rooms, could still, eventually, be made right. Eleanor Whitmore never remarried. It was not, as some in the county assumed, out of grief that never faded, though she did carry her husband's memory with a tenderness that never quite left her. It was, rather, that she had found something in those difficult years that she had never expected to find as a young bride entering an aristocratic marriage, a sense of herself, built not on a husband's title or a father's legacy, but on her own two hands, her own patience, and her own refusal to accept that a locked door was meant to stay locked forever. She kept the East Wing study exactly as she had restored it for the rest of her life, not as a monument to old family shame, but as a reminder that even the most carefully buried truths eventually find their way into the light, if only someone is patient enough and brave enough to go looking. Years later, when a young relation asked her how she had done it, how a widow with nothing had built something that outlasted a duke's certainty, Eleanor would only smile and say that she had simply refused to believe that ruin was the end of the story. She had not known, that cold Tuesday morning, when the letter arrived sealed with a crest no one living was meant to use, that she was standing at the very beginning of an entirely different life. But she had opened it all the same. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more forgotten tales of English aristocracy, hidden letters, and the quiet women history so often underestimated. And don't forget, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Thank you for staying until the very end.